Welcome to the L Plate podcast, where we sit at Jesus' feet until he's formed in us. I'm your brother and fellow disciple, Pardon Shagwai. The goal of this podcast is to stir each other to follow Jesus. In the New Testament, believers of Jesus are commonly referred to as followers or disciples of Jesus. These titles or pronouns, they are a lot cleaner and very descriptive of what we are to be in Christ, followers of him and disciples of him. So we acknowledge that we will always be students, we are always wearing our L plate, and we are always learning. Even after we've learned, we still remain his students. So we've been looking at the teachings of Jesus from the book of Matthew chapter 7, talking about the narrow and the wide gate, obedience that stands or withstands trials, the separation between the voice of God from all the other noise that's in your world. And so today I'll be looking at verses 1 to verse maybe verse 5 of the same chapter. And I want to acknowledge the Bible Project, whose research and published material I relied upon heavily in this preparation. So I'll read Matthew chapter 7 from verse 1 to verse 5. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged as well. And with the same measure that you use, it will be used to you as well. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank or the beam that's in yours? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs, for if you do, they may tremble upon them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. The first question I'll ask is this: is Jesus forbidding all manner of judgment? And what is judgment? So the approach that I will take in this teaching is to make an assertion first, and then I'll provide the reasoning or the evidence based on the text and other supporting texts about that assertion. So this is my assertion, is that Jesus is teaching us not to condemn others, but instead to practice self-reflection and humility. By teaching that we will be judged by the same standards, we are to judge others. He is encouraging us to have compassion over condemnation on others. So I was discussing recently with a friend, we're talking about each time that you read a word from the Bible, or you want to use a word that's in the Bible, it is important to be conscious that that word is written within a sentence, and that sentence is constructed in a verse, and that verse exists in a chapter. And the chapters put together, they make a book. And the book is in a testament, and the testament is in the Bible. And why all this is important is these themes which run through the entire Bible, through a testament, through a book, through a chapter, through a verse. So we should be very careful not just to pick single words and fix our understanding of the text based on that and ignoring all else. So Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, it does hold implications for the way that we live and the way that we relate with others. Therefore, we need to look closely at the context that Jesus is operating in to understand the nuances of his usage of this word, judgment. If you go to the book of John, chapter 3, verse 17, Jesus says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to judge or to condemn, but to save the world through him. But only a few chapters later, Jesus also comes back and says, "For judgment I came into the world." That's John chapter 9, verse 39. Now, we know that Jesus is not conflicted about his mission. He knows exactly why he came. So now the question is, Master, did you come to judge or did you not come to judge? And across these three verses I've read, the Greek word that is used for the word judgment is called krino, K-R-I-N-O. And this word means to decide or to consider or to determine the correctness of a matter. But also, this word means to condemn in a legal sense. So if we are to pay attention to the context, is Jesus saying, do not be discerning, as in that type of judgment, to discern, to understand, to make sense of? Or is he saying, do not be condemning? I think what might be helpful is to look at the verses that follow, that Jesus tells his followers. And he says this: why do you look at the speck of dust in your brother's eye? So he's saying this to people who are looking at someone's behavior, someone who's behaving poorly. And he's saying, why do you look at the speck of dust in your brother's eye? So he's acknowledging that, yes, the speck of dust is there. He's not denying it. There is a speck of dust. But he says, why do you look at that speck of dust when you've got a plank in your own eye? You're a hypocrite. What is this behavior? It is judgment. But what type of judgment is it? Is it discernment? Is it condemnation? I reckon it is condemnation. But not long after this, in verses 15 to 20, of the same chapter, Jesus says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit, you will recognize them. What is this behavior? It's judgment. What type of judgment? Is it discerning? Is it condemnation? I think in this context, it means be discerning. So on this second instance, Jesus is teaching believers to discern the true character of people by observing the kind of fruit that they bear. So Jesus in one verse forbids us from condemning people, but in another, he is encouraging us to be full of discernment. Because for him, he didn't just teach this, he lived this and he modeled this. Regularly, he addressed people's harmful choices, particularly the hypocritical Pharisees. He would call them out. So it wouldn't make sense that he would call them out when he's modeling the behavior to do and then prohibit his followers from discerning in their relationships or in the world. Maybe to illustrate this idea of condemnation, we'll turn to a story where Jesus, there's a woman who comes to Jesus and she's anointing him with costly perfume. She brings perfume in an alabaster jar, and she begins to kiss his feet. She begins to wash his feet with her tears, and she dries his feet with her hair. And finally, she pours this expensive, fragrant perfume onto his feet. Now, there was an important man who was there, Simon. It was an important man. He was a religious man. And he's watching this and he doesn't say the words, but he thinks in his mind, if this man was a prophet, he would know who and what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, that she is a sinner. So what Simon does is he judges this woman on the outside and decides that this woman is unworthy of Jesus' time and attention. He condemns her. He condemns the woman. But Jesus knows both Simon's thoughts and the woman's love that compels a brave and, vulnerable act. So when Jesus turns to Simon, he addresses his thoughts to the question. He says to him, Simon, imagine there are two debtors. One debtor owes a lot. The other debtor owes hardly anything, just a little bit. And the lender chooses to cancel both these debtors. And he asks him, of the two people who owed, who will love the lender more? The one who had more or the one who owed less? To which Simon rightfully responds and says, of course, the one with the bigger debt. They would love the lender more because they've been forgiven of much. Now, Jesus points out how Simon didn't perform any acts of hospitality towards him from the moment that he entered. But this woman, when she saw her need for Jesus, she did not stop attending to him. Because she had a great debt that had been forgiven, she is compelled by love for him. But Simon, on the other hand, he doesn't see his need for Jesus' forgiveness. His gratefulness is not at the same level as this woman. In fact, his positive judgment of himself leads him to a position where he can look down on this woman and wrongly condemn her actions. And this is the kind of contempt that Jesus has in mind when he tells his followers, do not judge one another, for by the same measure you judge, you are also going to be judged. Now, the next verses, which we've already read, verses 3 to verse 6, Jesus is now addressing the issue that requires careful discernment and how his followers should approach each other over issues, because issues are going to be there. Like I said earlier on, he doesn't deny that there is issues. He doesn't deny that there is a speck of sawdust in another one's eye. The speck is there, but how do we approach this? That's how he answers in these verses. I'll read them again. He says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank or the beam in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. The first thing to do is take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. These verses, they suggest that there is a time and place to speak up when we see a problem. I mean, like Jesus, we can remember a few times that he calls out wrongdoing in ways, that do not condemn or diminish others, but he did call them out. And in this metaphorical language that he uses about speck and plank in the eye, it's right at the end that he allows to assess another person's behavior. For the most part, he is talking about self-reflection. He's talking about humility. And in Simon's story, Jesus' response is, he points him to look inwardly and address his own issues. Take out your own plank. Take out your own beam. Only then can you evaluate the speck in somebody else's eye. And I think, each time that we choose to reflect on our own failures, each time that we choose to reflect on our own weaknesses, we reflect on our own sins, our own faults, it brings humility to us. It humbles us. And just like the woman who wept at Jesus' feet, we are reminded of our deep need for God. And it's from this place of honesty and humility that we see that we are less likely to condemn or think less of other people, because we are aware that we too have also done wrong. We are aware that we too have got issues that need God to deal with. The Jesus follower, should approach others with humility and gentleness, operating from a posture of forgiveness and grace, even where offense has occurred. And we see that throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about how he clearly sees our inner motivations. He's talking about, it's not so much about the external things, but he sees the internal motivations, the hidden realities that shape our lives in a way that no one else can. So when Jesus looks at our outward actions, he is also aware of the grief that's inside. He is also conscious of the disappointments. He's also aware of the sincere desire in our hearts to please God. So when we as mere humans condemn another, we act as though we can see their inner realities just as clearly, of which we don't. And in that, we are playing God. As finite beings, we don't have what it takes to make such a complex judgment on our own. He can, because he can see the action that's been done. He can see the motivation that was there. He can see the intentions that were there. He can see the attitudes around that action, which for us, all we can see is the action that's been taken. So now when Jesus says, don't judge lest you will be judged, He is that you are going to be judged by the same measure that you judge others as well. And I think this is the golden rule that, he sums up as the golden rule when he says in verse 12. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. Now, can you imagine a world where everyone treats everyone else the way that they wanted to be treated? With fairness, with kindness, with generosity and love. Instead of sizing up one another, instead of trying to determine who's better, who's worse, instead we choose to love one another, because that's how we are. We also want to be treated. What happens when we, rather being so quick to judge, we instead are quick to wonder, how do I want people to approach me when I drop the ball? How do I want people to approach me when I fail? Is that the same way that I'm also approaching this person? And I think that operating from this angle, it will temper our responses. It will alter our responses. It will increase our wisdom. And most importantly, it will draw us close and deeper with strong bonds in our mutual love for our neighbors. And this helps us to live out the greatest command of all, that is to love God and all others with everything that we've got. And I don't believe that by the statement, judge not, lest you also be judged, that Jesus is saying all judgment is wrong. I believe he's calling people to a new and a better way of relating with one another. Instead of judgmentally condemning or looking down on each other, he is calling us to bring love that can bring healing to what is broken, than just hating on what we don't like. So I'm trusting that with this encouragement, God will do a work in our hearts to approach our relationships, to approach one another with love and not with judgment. Until next time, friends, keep your eyes on Jesus front and back, because disciples do not graduate. May God richly bless you. Thank you.